Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living landscapes around us and within us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and interrelational nature, where we explore ways to root down intimately with the land, ecosystems, communities, and practices that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we remember to belong in.
Crack me wide open.
And it doesn't matter whether you're in a forest or whether you're in a city. Going to places like trees, springs, wells, caves, these are holy places, holy in the sense of their whole making. The etymology of holy is the same as healthy, wholesome. It's Old English word, heilig. And so it's about being made whole again. So if we're talking about situational knowledge or being, ways of being, for me it boils down to wherever you are, there you are. How do you find wholeness where you are? You go to the places who know how to make you whole.
Now that I am wide open and bleeding, I was made for this, I trust.
Dr. Saskia von Diest is the founder of Ecofluency, an organisation that offers consulting, teaching and facilitation in the science, art and practical magic of nature communication. She has a PhD in plant pathology and has held 2 international collaborative postdoctoral fellowships to research intuitive farming. Ecofluency also promotes other human voices in the broader field of nature communication, presenting multiple invitations into these deeper ways of knowing for individual and collective transformation. Saskia is also trained in family constellations and in the way of the warrior healer. Saskia is one of our special guests on our year-long slow study course, Deepen Your Roots, where she'll be joining us during the module More Than Human Kinship, where we'll be looking at animistic interspecies communication, birdsong recognition and the myths and folktales carried in their wings and songs, deconstructing the dominant anthropocentric overculture in the great unravelling of these times, and further apprenticeship with furred, feathered, barked and budded ones. Deepen Your Roots spans 13 moon cycles, weaving deep ecology, the work that reconnects, and a folkloric animistic exploration into the ecological self rewoven with place. It is an intergenerational calling into bioregional guardianship and the cultivation of profound belonging. Throughout the programme, you will have the opportunity to explore and develop offerings to nourish your ecological niche and bring your medicine forth into the world. You can learn more at rootedhealing.org/deepen, and we can offer you 10% off if you enrol before in bulk, which is the start of February, with the code DEEPEN10. And we are returning this summer with our gathering Ancestral, where we embody the ancient ways of our Indigenous ancestors, the ones who lived in full relationship with the landscapes, and through the animate landscapes, roundhouse councils, ceremonies, and intimate village life, we access their wisdom and guidance for these turbulent times with new and ancient eyes. We also still have space at our April and May Earth Medicine psilocybin retreats. So if you're curious about ceremonial work with psilocybin in a safe and legal setting, follow the link in the show notes. One of the many things Saskia speaks to in this conversation was how being born illegally during an apartheid influenced her sense of place and belonging growing up. And so it feels needed to name the immense devastation and brutality happening to Palestinians who have been forced into apartheid for the past couple of generations since the forced formation of Israel. And as the catastrophic bombing of Gaza continues, I witness this shift in awareness that is being called forth and the deep reflection and call to action that is taking hold in many spheres, especially in the healing and spiritual arts. And seeing pictures of the 8-metre apartheid wall controlled by the Israeli government sparked a conversation with my mum and her remembering the Berlin Wall in her lifetime. And I have this sense of trauma perpetuating itself. And so amongst our exploration of rooting to place and what it means to how we then behave in this world, I want to honour uprootedness and to acknowledge the privilege of rooting to place amongst a global backdrop of social unrest, violent uprooting, and an entangled polycrisis. Through our council calls on the course and deep inquiry into the ecological self rewoven with place, we will also create space for staying with the trouble and explore our roles in the collective threads that plead for broader tending. How do we heal ourselves and each other, including the non-human, in a toxic dominant culture? I think it's work that needs togetherness, a calling in rather than calling out, to orientate ourselves in the original roundhouse with mentors, guides, elders, and young voices who ignite our roots to active hope. And we've talked about this in the first chapter of the course materials. The great turning requires us to, I'm going to use a quote from Cole Arthur Riley of Black Liturgies, to quote, reimagine the very patterns by which we correct one another and ourselves in our attempts to liberate. And she continues, correction is sacred, but the power doesn't have to look like the power of those who seek to destroy us. End quote. Joanna Macy calls this power with, in opposition to the power over we so often see used in industrial culture. And I love Black Liturgies. I think Cole Arthur Riley is bringing beautiful work into this world. If you don't know her writing, do check it out. And she's added in the same thread 2 more quotes. Bell Hooks said, shaming is one of the deepest tools of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy because shame produces trauma and trauma often produces paralysis. And Audre Lorde said, for so long we have been encouraged to view each other with suspicion, as eternal competitors, or as the visible face of our own self-rejection. And with this, I do want to stay humble and admit that shame may be absolutely necessary as a tool in activism, especially in calling out big corporations. But when it comes to acquaintances in our echo chambers, I do think calling in would be far more effective in our efforts to unite voices. When we employ compassion and seek to understand and collaborate rather than shame or compete, we co-create an environment ripe for dialogue, growth, healing, and the recovering of our response abilities. And so I feel called to say this isn't business as usual at Rooted Healing. Firstly, Rooted Healing is in and of itself massively countercultural to what Joanna Macy refers to as business as usual. But also, the work will always evolve and be shaped by what is arising in the ecosystems of our bodies, our landscapes, and of the collective web of life. So with that, I'll leave you to the nourishment of this conversation with Saskia. I have added the book Subtle Agroecologies, Farming with the Hidden Half of Nature, which has such a fascinating abundance of co-author chapters, including the one by Saskia, and also the microbial meditation she mentions in this episode, both inside our Patreon community at patreon.com/rootedhealing. Well, I love to begin by getting a sense of you and the place that shaped you. So I'd love it if you can introduce yourself with your name as given from your parents and any aspect of the land that really raised you. And then finally, a being or another element or aspect of the land you'd like to weave into this conversation in spirit.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you for that invitation. And so my name is Saskia van Diest, born Linker. And due to family drama, our family took on my grandmother's maiden name, van Diest. And also I need to note, I'm going to name it because it is in my field. Forgive me if I maybe come across a little bit distracted or incoherent today. I was in a car accident on Monday night while I was on my way home. Fortunately, completely unscathed, thanks to Spirit Team. Like, I felt that circling just before it happened, and I was consciously aware of that. So that's just, if I come across in any way like bzz, it's because of that.
Yeah, bless you. That must have been a shock on the system.
It was, and I'm still it's still surfacing. And I believe that I have my nature parents to thank for my safety. So I was born smack bang in the heart of Johannesburg. And my nature parents, which is a concept that I learned when doing a course with Ellen Kittredge and Cynthia Berg recently, Wisdom of the Body, Wisdom of Nature. They introduced me to this concept, which is from the sacred Andean tradition in Peru, where you have not only your biological parents, but you also have aspects of nature in the landscape who are present and assigned to you at the time of your birth. So your nature mother, or in the native language there is Quechua, is the Pacarina. So for me, she is the source of the Yuxke River. And that is a river that is a tributary into Crocodile River that flows into the Limpopo River, which is the second largest in South Africa, and goes along the border with Zimbabwe and Mozambique, I think. And my nature father is the Wilds Nature Reserve with the surrounding hills there, my Ituapu. So I'm just naming those because I only recently was initiated into getting to know them again. And it was such a strange experience of not knowing about this before. And many cultures have something similar, but I love this idea that one can have nature parents. Of course, all of us are indigenous to Mother Earth. If one thinks of her as female, how can one not? And that has shaped me more recently than anything else. I've also been working with the landscape that I've recently moved to. So I moved back from England to South Africa 3 months ago. And I live in the Eden district along the south coast of the Western Cape, in the Garden Route. And there are many big yellowwood trees here. And the yellowwood is a tree that I've been working with a little bit recently as well. So these are some of the beings that, invoking, honoring, revering, they form a part of who I am now. I've asked them to be on my spirit team. They're allies. Yeah, they're part of my ecosystem.
Ah, amazing. I've also not heard of these nature parents, and I immediately had maybe the Preseli Mountains in West Wales come to mind for me. And
wow,
would that be the River Tavy? Oh, that's something I really want to inquire into. Yeah.
those are special hills. I've visited those. Those are very, very gorgeous special hills.
Yeah.
What a beautiful idea.
Oh, I love that you spent time in Pembrokeshire. Oh.
Yeah.
You've spoken so beautifully about eco-fluency, which is coming through you with such grace, and how everything becomes everyone through this process. So is this something that's always been clear for you, or did a particular event or influence shape your capacity to relate intimately across species, across ecosystems in this way?
I think that as a child, myself, as well as many other children, would have that way of thinking be an obvious one, that animist way of thinking. But I don't have a conscious memory of it being that is my worldview. What I do remember is being told very clearly how science would be the best way of approaching the world and solving the world's problems. So from the age of 6, I wanted to be a scientist. And that was the only track that I thought of possible for myself. And so adopting a more animist ontology or worldview was a very slow process of evolution in my thinking, shaped by experiences mostly. And it really was the animal communication workshop that I did during my PhD. That was the single most pivotal moment in my life to date, because everything changed. I went on to do another year of my PhD and then 7 years of postdoctoral research. But now, thinking of myself as like a recovering academic, it's also a matter of rehabilitating my worldview to be one that is more expansive, to be thinking of oneself as embedded in the wider ecology, as being not only on the earth, but of the earth, being the earth herself, as we are all.
And for anyone who has not been familiar with ecofluency and your work, to give people a sense of what it is that you're weaving.
So ecofluency, let's start with the etymology, because, you know, as academics, we always love that. Eco comes from the Greek word oikos, which means habitat, home. So similar to like economy or economics and ecology, it's all studies of our home, how to manage our home, how to be in our home, how our home is. And fluency comes from the Latin fluentum, which means both fluid, but also means relaxed. So ecofluency is as much a way of being able to commune and communicate and relate with the more than human world, with our habitat, essentially, more than the built environment, as it is about learning to do less and just being in a relaxed way. It's paradox, because it's as much learning new things as it is about unlearning what we've already learned, that are barriers to being able to communicate and commune and be with the rest of nature in ways that are our ancestral birthright. And so it's a word that dropped into my mind in 2018 while I was reviewing an academic paper that a colleague was drafting on ecoliteracy. And ecoliteracy is this idea of being able to read into the book of nature in a way that this is how we get to learn. And I was thinking to myself, it doesn't sit right. It's like watching somebody's facial expressions and reading their lips and looking at their body language and thinking, oh, I wonder what they're really saying. But if you just listened more clearly, that changes things. And so that word ecofluency dropped just in my mind then. And I believe that it was nature that was like, here, have this. What do you want to do with that? And so that started blossoming, growing into something that now I use as the word to embody my work. But as a concept, it's by no means new. It's just one of the latest iterations of something that is very ancient. And it's a language older than words that we can all do using a wider range of senses and awareness. And it's about two-way conversation, dialogue, because many people will say, I do talk to my plants and my animals, but my invitation is to listen, and to listen with more of ourselves.
I'd love you to speak a bit more about your becoming into this world, because you've written that you were born a crime during the apartheid. And would you say being born between two worlds informed your path of communicating beyond the sort of explicit mainstream paradigm? And how did this earlier becoming shape the work you carry now?
More so in the past than now. The way I operated in the world had a lot to do with being the child of a German father, born in Bavaria and moved to South Africa, and a Muslim Indian mother of Gujarati ancestry, born in South Africa. And they were from extremely different backgrounds, both culturally, from education level, in all ways you can imagine, economically as well. And I've often felt like I didn't know where I belong, whether that was continent, whether it was culture, friendship circle, sometimes even species. I was deeply ashamed of being human for most of my young life, partly because of the havoc we cause in the world. That wound has healed for me now, mostly. But it is a challenge. And it's partly to do with the pain of not knowing where we belong, like Toko Turner talks about in her book, Belonging, Remembering Ourselves Home. And there's a beautiful quote in her book, which I'll read. True happiness depends on our reciprocity with the environment. in which we are embedded and unto which we are indebted. And so feeling torn between worlds which are described by human concepts of belonging, like, for example, which culture, which religion, which continent, country do you belong to? That made me feel lonely in a way that I'd never identified. And it was in that animal communication workshop that I did, now it's 11 or 12 years ago. That was my way of accessing this knowing, not just identifying, oh, I didn't realize how lonely I am, to I don't need to feel lonely ever again, because now I have skills, tools, language to be able to relate with any aspect of nature. I could be left on a desert island with nobody around, and if I survive, I could communicate with the sand, with the sun, with the sea, with all of life around me. Of course, I'd miss human contact, but I wouldn't be alone, and it would become a survival skill, because this belonging sometimes is tied to our survival, not just a matter of belonging for the sake of spiritual notions, but critical to how we can relate with our environment. So it was a slow process of moving past this rift that I felt, especially growing up in South Africa. You know, it was, my mother and father weren't even allowed to get married. They did so in secret. And then I was born during apartheid. So that's been embedded in me. But now, many years later, it feels like I've been able to use that feeling of being a bridge between different worlds and exercise it in ways now of being able to, let's say, take academic jargon and translate it into something for the public in this way, in this field of work with interspecies communication. But it also means being able to take the intangible, what's so difficult, to take that tacit knowing of interspecies communication and translate that into a way of conveying the messages that I get from the rest of nature. So it's informed so many different ways of being for me.
It's a whole other perspective to this work and to the pathways to belonging that I feel descends all of this, the surface level things, this mistaking having of a being, and all of the ways we're trying to compensate to access that fitting in, which Toko differentiated, hasn't she? This fitting in versus actual belonging. You've written that communication is fundamental to finding harmony in any relationship, as it engenders trust and facilitates healing. So I'd love for you to speak to this idea of growing a secure attachment with nature through this communication. What does that entail? You've spoken of that desert island so beautifully. I think that was a very tangible taste.
The thing that always comes to mind for me is the way we relate with ourselves, with the rest of nature, which includes other humans, boils down to the dynamics and patterns that we learn in childhood, that we've inherited from our family, from our culture, that we are taught in schools, that we might have carried over from other lives. Side note, I deliberately say other lives, not past lives, because I don't think of time as linear. And I don't necessarily assume that everybody has that idea as part of their worldview, but I'm including that to recognize that our way of relating stems from many different ways, because we are ecosystems. We carry all of ourselves, many selves with us. So when we are relating, one of the ways we do that is through communication. We watch each other's body language. I talk a lot with my hands. We watch each other's facial expressions, our lips, our eyes. We feel the sense of what's going on. But verbal communication helps a lot for us as a human species, because it helps to make tangible in a way that is consensus-based. What do we mean? More or less consensus-based. What do we mean when I say this and you say that? So it's about finding where are the friction points, where is the common ground, so that we can develop our way of relating. And this is not always a conscious thing, but we do this with our friends, with our partners, with our family, with our work colleagues, with our enemies or frenemies, if you have those. And so with the rest of the world and social media, in everything, we're doing this give, take, pushback thing. But having that made easier to deal with through conscious communication, I've found that doing this with nature has helped to get to the core of those dynamics, to the wounds that we've carried, the judgments that we carry. For example, meeting another animal, whether it's a dog, whether it's an elk, whether it's an elephant, and seeing the form and having my judgments placed that I'd learned, those patterns, those dynamics, those judgments projected onto that other being, and having that communication with a being like that, and them throwing back like a mirror. Nature always loves mirroring. What do you really mean? What do you really see? How are you perceiving? That's challenged things for me. So then it's also challenged, how do I perceive myself? And I'm going off on a tangent. So when you talk about secure attachment, for example, first we'd have to unpack the word attachment, which we won't do now for the sake of time. But for me, it feels like, how do we attach in early childhood? And then we could go off into tangent about psychology and attachment styles. But for me, it had to do with thinking of animals as being better, for example, as a child than plants, because they could move and they had a central nervous system. Now, I know that that's not true. And I've experienced communication on a deeper level, also with microbes, also with nature spirits, beings who don't even have physical bodies, elementals. I'm not sure how one can develop a secure attachment with nature through communication, because everybody's starting point will be different. Some people don't feel safe in nature. Maybe they've grown up in a culture where they've had to walk through dark forest at night, and now they feel scared of going into the forest, where for me, that would be a magical experience. But communication is the starting point for recognizing, where are our wounds? How much charge do they hold over us? Where can it move from being trauma to being something that can be just informing our way of being, and moving beyond that as a learning experience? And that necessarily doesn't happen in this lifetime always, but it's a starting point. So we are in relationship all the time with the rest of nature. Because we are in relationship, as with any relationship, communication is going to be that fundamental, one of the fundamental methods. And that communication doesn't only happen through visual images in our mind, voices in our head, verbal language necessarily. It will happen through feelings, emotions, sensations, dreams. All of that is communication. So when we open up that wider range of senses and awareness, we're listening with more of ourselves. And that starts to unlock stuck things in ourselves. And that starts to help us to feel a little bit more secure. But it's not a linear process, and there's no clear map. I have some maps, but of course, as is always said, the map is not the terrain. So for me, nature communication has helped me heal from clinical depression and being suicidal without psychiatric medication. That's not necessarily going to be somebody else's journey. But it had to do with me finding trust, time and time again being shown by nature that I have the full support, guidance, love from the more than human world, who are more powerful than any other human or group of humans. And as one of my teachers used to say, we have free will and nature has the power. We lend her our will, she will lend us her power. So it's starting small and building up that trust that becomes a way of finding, let's call it secure attachment, or maybe right relationship than attachment.
Right relationship feels more fluid. And what I'm hearing in you, and this life-saving capacity for communing at this deeper, more intimate, more spiritual, I don't know if that's the right word either, level, it feels like it's a cultivation of faith in nature.
For me, it is. And I want to just for a moment touch again on this right relationship. The idea of attachment, for me, stems from a feeling of a need that needs to be met. This expectation that there's something else being fulfilled that we cannot do for ourselves. So now I'm moving more from a space of having felt like I need to have my needs met by only humans, to also being able to lean, sometimes very hard, on the rest of nature. And then it moves from a place of needing to attach to one of, like I said, right relationship, which is more about finding balance in that relationship, that reciprocity, finding harmony, so that there's, as you said, a fluidity. And then it starts to open up to a space of being able to thrive within that relationship. There's joy, there's peace, there's abundance. There's more than just the need to heal from our wounds. Then the magic really starts to become scintillating.
Yeah, poignant, and highlights again the power of language and our different attachments to words in their capacity for us to try and attempt to describe a relationship really that's ineffable when you've fully embodied it. Yeah, you've talked about ecofluency as a kind of attunement with one's larger home in nature, and relating this to that deep, intimate, sensual relationship with the house home. And that makes me think of the smells when you walk through the door and the familiar sounds and the way the light moves through the windows. And so this feels important when we talk about rising biophilia and this rising disconnect and the city dwellers and so forth. And so how did they cultivate this feeling of home in nature when it's not there? For example, right now I'm in Bavaria, in Munich, and I just don't have such immediate access. Sitting with a tree in the park, yes, I can do it, but I feel much more focused on how I'm being perceived than I want to be. What would you say to people who perhaps have some of those barriers in place?
I'm not sure if it helps to be reminded that the disconnect that people feel when they talk about feeling disconnected from nature, I don't know if it helps to be reminded that it's an illusion, because it is an illusion. Of course we are nature. We just forget that we are. We're made of the earth herself. We are animal, we are microbial, we are ecosystems. We're embedded within larger ecosystems. Whether it's in a city or in a forest, we are nature. We're breathing the air. It is in our body. We drink water, we eat food, we walk on the earth. Our homes, the very buildings that we think of as being not nature, is nature because it's made of materials that have been mined from her body. The plants that you have in the room, your own physical body, that is about the most intimate that we can get. So that is my starting point, the recognition of the disconnect as illusion. My invitation then is to start naming and feeling how you are nature, where you are in nature. A city is just another place on this beautiful earth. Yes, you don't have the kind of biodiversity you have in a forest. We don't even have the same kind of biodiversity in our microbial gut biome that we should have, ideally, compared to maybe 100 or 200 years ago or further back. And yet we're still here, we're still alive. The fact that we're alive means we are nature. I don't know if I can speak appropriately to the question, partly because we live in an age now where nature referrals, green prescriptions have become a thing, where doctors and psychologists can clinically refer people, prescribe time to spend in nature, whether it's a park or a forest or a beach, and requiring approximately 2 hours a week in order to feel well. Part of me is like, that's absurd that we even live in this time. And I also recognize the value and the need of that. But I will be recording something. It's a little guided exercise to commune and communicate with your body and your microbiome. Because those are the first ones that keep you alive. This instrument that we have, this ecosystem, this tiny earth that we are, that is how we relate with the rest of the world. So that's my first invitation. Remember, you are nature. That's your starting point. And even if it means you have to fake it till you make it, put a little sticker on your mirror and tell yourself, I am nature, I am nature, I am nature. Do that. How am I nature? I have hair like a fox. I have teeth like a bear. I have eyes like a fish. I have feet that can stand on the ground like roots of a tree. I am microbed by this earth.
Yeah, so beautifully put. And it's something I've been exploring a lot and will definitely be threaded into the course, which you are so wonderfully going to be speaking on. It's through connecting with our microbial ecosystem within that we really start to understand how integral our relationship to not only our environment, but to the food systems is, because everything we're eating, we are becoming, it is literally integrating into that internal ecosystem. And when we think animistically with that,
I mean, it can be really unpacked. Like, how much are you percentage-wise Chilean avocado, for example, South African orange? But then beyond that, like, how much of not just the microbes, but the energy, the cultural energy of that landscape are you embedding in your nervous system? How much are you vibrating with that frequency? And that becomes very juicy ground for exploration. And then it starts to inform our inner landscape, not just on a physical level with the microbes, but that inner council that we have with our own inner child, inner parents, inner nature ally, inner dragon, blah, 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 all of that, and we can start to feel that sort of that dancing with the ancestors happening, because our very first ancestors were the elementals. Before there were humans, there was the rest of nature. Before that, there was the rock, and there was fire, and there was air, and there was water, and all of that when the earth was being formed. So all of that becomes part of that dance.
There's so much wisdom in these traditions that have been carried forth from thousands and thousands of years of lineage. I think of the grandmother stones in the sweat lodge ceremony and the elemental alchemy that really creates all the ceremonies I've been immersed in, at least. There's a real acknowledging of those origins, of the primordial nature of who we are, what we are. Well, you've talked a lot about intuition and elementals and energetics, and this language feels pretty familiar to me after many years of being in the healing arts. I'm curious how it's been for you bridging some of this language into the world of academia, but mostly actually agriculture.
It's such a big topic. I was such a rubbish academic, honestly. I lost interest in doing the nitty-gritty primary research. I don't have the patience for it, honestly. I started feeling like my animal body I felt like I had to molt some kind of skin. I had to get out of academia because I felt like I was caged. And so that's why I left it and started Ecofluency 3 years ago. But even during my postdoc research, I noticed how, as you say, it's starting to enter mainstream discussions, this idea of intuition, intuitive farming, for example. And there are many different questions in what you've actually asked, but maybe I'm going to boil it down to just, how does intuition feature in this kind of work? How does it offer an access point? And I say that I lost interest in how it works and stayed more interested in that it works and how people do it. But I do sometimes like going back to like how it might work. Can't help it. And so this is something I actually teach in the 6-week course on the online course on Ecofluency. We touch a little bit on ritual and ceremony and how intuition is helpful in accessing that, or how ritual and ceremony create a space that is conducive to access our intuition. Because it allows us to activate our listening through the heart. It allows information to come through our imagination and our intuition, which, great thinkers like Rudolf Steiner used to describe as being ways of accessing higher knowledge. And these are important instruments when receiving information from nature. So I actually wrote a chapter in a book called Subtle Agroecologies, which was edited by Dr. Julia Wright from Coventry University. And so during the last bit of my postdoc, there was a chapter that I wrote for that book alongside 36 other authors, which I highly recommend if anybody's interested in delving deep into quantum thinking and agriculture. And my chapter was in intuitive farming, heart-based decisions for harmony in agricultural systems. Or scientists like the ones at the HeartMath Institute in the US do fantastic work. So they found that intuition seems to operate with certain neural correlates across various regions of the brain. And now I'm like partly tapping into that chapter. But the heart, because people focus so much on the brain when it comes to intuition, but the heart has an electromagnetic field 5,000 times stronger than the brain. And it seems to be involved in not only receiving and processing and decoding intuitive information, but it can respond to an event before it actually happens. And that is wild because this explains both the immediacy of intuition and the possibility of information originating from outside the body. Because there's no consensus within Western mainstream science about what intuition is. They talk about it as being one part of our decision-making, and they talk about the fact that it arises within the body or information lands in the body. But where that information comes from, nobody knows. And the best definition for it is knowing without knowing how you know. Great. But I love the work of Roland McCraty and other scientists at the HeartMath Institute because they wanted to understand the mechanics of intuition. So they broke it out into 3 different types. And this is what I'm just going to say about it because this speaks to your question. The first kind of intuition is implicit intuition. And this is the kind of knowledge that's gained through tacit learning. It's the most commonly understood type. It's the kind that people in business and psychology and medical research will describe as something that you can learn from experts. It's gained through experience. It's something that can be transferred from expert to initiate person who's learning. Then the second kind is energetic sensitivity, which is when the nervous system detects and responds to signals in their environment, such as from electromagnetic fields. And so this is the kind of thing that when you walk into a room, you can get a vibe of what's going on. Or you walk into a house that may be, let's say, called haunted, and you're like, ooh, something's off here. Or you walk into a room and somebody's just been given bad news, and without even knowing what that news was, you walk and you feel it. Because you've picked up on the electromagnetic information that's being sent from people's nervous systems. Because our nervous system is electrical, like any electrical system, it has in its own electromagnetic field. It's going to vibrate at a specific frequency. We pick up on those signals. And it's not always conscious, but making that conscious becomes very interesting. Then we also have non-local intuition. And this is my favorite because it's not limited to time and space. And it's the kind of intuition that's associated with precognition, clairvoyance, and this starts to speak to interspecies communication because it means that you can be communicating with a dog in India, with your ancestors beyond time, with the planets out in the ecosystem, in the solar system, and beyond even. You can use it to really tap into information in the more than human natural environment, seen and unseen. And this starts to give a potential explanation, one mechanism, because I think it's going to be multiple mechanisms when we finally understand what is the underlying mechanism of intuition and intuitive communication with nature. I felt like I was hitting my head against a brick wall very often. So many journals that turned down the papers I wrote just on intuitive decision-making with farmers, or farmers that were using intuition, not even intuitive communication with nature. It was beyond the scope of what they said it was beyond the scope of the journal. In truth, I know that it was threatening their worldview, and it threatens the entire worldview of science, at least mainstream reductionist materialist science, which is fine, as long as we understand that it's an epistemology. It doesn't have to be, something that becomes our belief system and dogma. But yeah, so when looking at biodynamics, for example, that became an access point to say there are existing methods of being able to develop our skills that farmers are using. It's more than 100 years old, these skills, or the work that's around this. Existing methods that are westernized, that are applicable to agriculture. Let's look at how those have been used by farmers to develop their intuition. Unfortunately, the languaging is often what puts people off. And so in my work, I, as much as possible, try to keep the language broad. I'll say to people, if you don't like the word spirit of place, then think of like overarching intelligence or guardian, or genius loci, or something else, deva. Find a word that works for you. Don't let the language be the barrier to you engaging in the thing. Still do the thing. Just find what is your access point.
That's very akin to a conversation I had with Ben, actually, even about animism, because for him, co-leading this course, he doesn't have such a resonance with that word. And yet he's so in relationship with nature. It's just interesting finding the words that give us the permission slip in a way.
It's not just about shifting perspectives. It's permission to be. It's permission to drop the shields, the barriers, to exploring deeper ways of knowing. Because in truth, it's about overcoming the fear to what we might find on the other side.
I've got people in mind who seem to live their whole lives without that permission to be, like in doing mode, and this inability to stop and entertain another way of relating with the world. A missing piece I perceive in so much research or philosophy or just general mainstream ideas and spiritualities is the importance of situational knowledge. And you've written, quote, this situational knowledge, which Haraway talks about, is generated through experience, language, culture, and tradition in situ, and through more than the 5 physical senses. These stocks of intuition or cultural capital are the product of tacit learning and expand on and contribute to a more holistic, pragmatic knowledge base than the explicit knowledge gained through modern science emphasis on the sense of vision and observation. I think when so much place-specific knowledge feels lost or buried or over-dominated by mainstream monoculture, how do we invite or innovate culture to turn back, so to speak? What do you feel is needed to reestablish and interweave situational knowledge with trust and integrity as well? Because there's a piece you've spoken about there around those wisdom keepers and those guardians of said knowledge, and then examples of how it can be exploited and so on and so forth. Just feels like a really big topic, especially when we also think about the monoculture of spirituality.
It actually ties into what we were previously talking about, permission to be. So for me, it's not only about permission to be, whether that's something physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, however you want to call it, in terms of permission to be in a still way, but it's also permission to be in an active way. Mm. So I found myself at a party on Saturday night, and I dance. I love dancing, and I don't have any classical training in any kind of dancing, which has been actually helpful in the same way that I've seen so many professional dancers, like they can't get out of that structure that their bodies have been trained in. We can't get out of. We sometimes find it difficult to get out of our trained ways of thinking about how to be in the world. And I was going like wild, all kinds of like weird dance moves, awkward, trying to be fancy and then trying to be deliberately not fancy. And it's the permission to be as weird as you want. That's what I offer people. I invite people to do, because that's when you tap into your animal self. That's when nature starts to be like, cool, let's play with you now. Because when you're so stiff, it's hard to play. Mm. And then you can start to play, and this ties to the question, that's when you can start to play with those who are around you. And I bring in play because we can get very intellectual about situational, place-based, blah, 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 and embodiment. Nature wants us to play. It wants us to dance, drum, sing, around a fire, hold ritual, have ceremony, dream, do all the little delicious things.
Nature wants us to play. I love that.
Nature wants us to play. It doesn't matter that I have drawn from various magical lineages and spiritual trainings from around the world. I find myself here now in Southern Africa along this coast. This coastline that has by some been called point of human origins, because there are some beautiful caves that have evidence of humans being here like hundreds of thousands of years ago. So what I find myself doing to speak to this place-based thing is to spend time with the more than human at large trees, with the moss in the forest or on rocks on the walls by the sidewalk in these caves that I've just mentioned. So for example, on the lunar eclipse at the end of October, while South Africa was busy winning the Rugby World Cup, I spent the evening under a 1,600-year-old yellowwood tree up in the Knysna forest, about 15 minutes away from where I currently live. I'd completely forgotten that it was actually our national tree, so it was like, cool, I was being patriotic in some way. But it wasn't about that. For me, it was the fact that ancient trees hold a huge amount of wisdom. They're keepers of the forest, guardians of the forest. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a forest or whether you're in a city. Going to places like trees, springs, wells, caves, these are holy places, holy in the sense of their whole making. The etymology of holy is the same as healthy, wholesome. It's the Old English word, heilig. I'm sure you know this already. And so it's about being made whole again. So if we're talking about situational knowledge, it's like, or being, ways of being. For me, it boils down to wherever you are, there you are. How do you find wholeness where you are? You go to the places who know how to make you whole. And there's a whole network of people that have documented springs around London, for example, about churches making pilgrimages along the south coast of England. Many different ways. There's many ways as there are humans alive, and more ways of engaging with our environment. Maybe your way is I'm speaking out to a listener. Maybe your way is just going and sitting by a tree with your back to the tree and you're breathing with the tree. Maybe somebody else's way is singing to the tree, or having the tree sing through them, offering your voice to nature. That there's less knowledge needed in the world and more knowing, better knowing. And this is how it happens. Those deeper, better ways of knowing, potentially, come from an embodied experience. And of course, we have our barriers. We have a lot of stuff that we carry. I'm trying to avoid the word trauma for many reasons, but we carry a lot of stuff and trauma and drama and patterns of interference in our bodies, in our energy fields. To get past that, dropping into the body, allowing ourselves to feel bit by bit, making space to feel safe, secure, joyful, accessing that joy. And this is not, we won't go into how to do that, but accessing that joy is the antidote to the fear, to the stuckness. Because like finding joy is like, okay, wow, that experience of sitting with a tree and breathing, I felt positively trippy. That was far out. That's going to stay with me for the rest of my life. And I do highly recommend putting your forehead against the tree at any given opportunity and breathing with the tree, because that is how you tap into the knowledge held in the land. Speak with the people, of course. Speak with the humans. If you want to move past the human drama, chat with a tree. Chat with a spring, with a fox.
Yeah.
Chat with yourself, because that's where you are first situated.
Joanna Macy's concept of active hope. Where do you find your active hope? Any final words, or even yellowwood?
Well, the reason I resonate strongly with the yellowwood tree is because it reminds me so much of the yew tree, which in the Northern Hemisphere is a very, very special kind of tree. And I've been working with the yew tree for 6, 7, 8 years now, and the yellowwood for the last year or two. And they both hold very similar kind of feeling, similar kind of magic, which is why I work with them as wisdom keepers, more than human wisdom keepers in places. And so one of my invitations is, whether it's a plant, tiny plant, or whether it's a towering tree, whether it's a small little insect, like a bee, or whether it's a very large mammal, whether it's a tiny clod of compost, one gardening, or whether it's a constellation of stars. Find the aspect of nature that resonates for you and just be with that. The invitation is to try less hard. I teach a lot of things about how to communicate with nature, and there are many fantastic maps, maybe better than mine, out there. But ultimately, you hold that capacity within yourself, and reclaiming that power, rekindling that capacity is something that's within you. You know, you could use somebody else's maps, but ultimately find the way that works for you best and do the thing. That's how I find my active hope. When in doubt, like having been in this car accident on Monday evening, I was surprised that the worst thing that happened was like the slight graze. I don't know if you can see it on my neck, just the slight graze from the seatbelt and a bump on my knee, and the handle of one of my bags broke, and the car was full of stuff. I mean, packed in such a way that I could still see out the back and obviously the blind spots, but I'd been traveling with a lot of my belongings. That accident could have ended very differently and could have been mangled. And yet it's the power, the wisdom, the love of nature that I'm still here, basically unscathed. And that comes, I believe, from having lent my will to nature and her lending her power, their power, because it's all of it and more than it. And one of my favorite sayings is this ancient Welsh triad on the primary essentials of genius. And this, like you said, harks back to your Welsh roots. So I like sharing this now. And oh my gosh, I've forgotten who the fantastic folk singer is. Robert something or other. I forgot his name. He translated it from Welsh to English. But the triad goes that the primary essentials of genius are the eyes to see nature, the heart to feel nature, and the boldness to dare follow nature. And I love that it's not just the boldness to follow, it's the boldness to dare follow nature. Meaning it doesn't have to seem logical for it to make sense to you.
Awen.
Awen.
Thank you so much, Saskia. Wow, you are a being I am in awe of. For people to come and find you, maybe give them some signposts.
Website, ecofluency.org. Newsletter, sign up through there. I'm also on Instagram at ecofluency, on Facebook. I teach and I consult in nature communication. I do energetic clearings as well. All the details are on the website. And the next offering, apart from the Rooted Healing Deepen Your Roots course that I'm so delighted to be a part of, there's also a 6-week course that I hold on a semi-regular basis that's coming up. And all of my online offerings are offered on a pay-what-you-can basis. So making it as accessible as possible to people. So feel free to tune in or pass on the details to anybody you might feel would like that.
So wild and free, she carries our hopes and dreams. Oh, in the night I come to you, so I can feel your glory in the morning dew.
If you found resonance with this conversation and the themes in this episode, please do head to rootedhealing.org/deepen to learn more about our year-long slow study course. That's enrolling now. Again, you can have 10% off with the code DEEPEN10 at checkout. That's in capitals, and I'll put that in the show notes. And you can really get a sense of what is being born forth here, this multi-generational calling, not only becoming bioregional guardians for our communities and ecosystems in this moment in time and finding our active hope, but really creating beautiful pathways forward for the generations to come.
I'll catch myself in the waves, oh, down along the wild shore.
Thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. We offer nature-led ceremonial gatherings, legal and safe psychedelic-assisted psilocybin retreats, embodied deep ecology courses, and a growing collection of nourishing resources. Visit rootedhealing.org to learn more. You can also find us on social media, and all the links are in the show notes. There are some wonderful acts of reciprocity and cross-pollination that you can do if you are enjoying this podcast, which will help others heal and connect, inner and outer landscapes. You can subscribe, rate the show 5 stars, leave a review. You can share episodes with your community. Sometimes those podcast recommendations from others have been the most potent medicine I've received in the moment. And you can join our Patreon community, where you can actively place value in this resource and receive bonus material, book and gift giveaways, meditations, workshops, episode transcripts, community discussion, and discounts to our events. Your monthly contribution helps us cover the costs of running the show, and our hope is to gather enough abundant gifters to really go the extra mile with this podcast. These acts of connection support this work. Thank you. The music in this episode was gifted by Bonnie Medicine from her latest album, Wide Open. I adore this album, go check it out. If you'd like to gift your music to the Rooted Healing podcast, please reach out via the link in the show notes. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.
At the edge of the water.